Hey, what's up, everybody? I hope you're having a good weekend. Just sitting here getting some work done. I'm not gonna lie, I'm trying to catch up on work. I got a nap in a little while ago. It felt good to finally get some sleep, and I think there's several of you who feel me on that. Um, so I think one of the things that's been on my mind is this chapter with the urinary system, and just making sure that everybody understands the different parts of what's going on in the urinary system. If you watched my last video, I really got into the nitty gritty of just being blunt about the chapter and how much stuff is in that chapter that's really dealing with just the nephron, and then breaking out some terms. If you haven't watched that video, oh, please go back and watch that video, because the terminology that I use in that video, you're going to see again. One of the things that I really wanted to talk about in this video, really short and sweet, is just talking about what the heck is going on in a neuron. Because it's like, hold up, let me close this. I got stuff popping up on my laptop, sorry. Little updates. So, what the heck is going on in a neuron, and why is it important? And I will say this. Here's a warning, all right? You need to understand the anatomy of a neuron. If you understand the anatomy of a neuron, it's going to make life so much more wonderful for you. If you don't understand the anatomy of a neuron, reach out to me. I will be checking email in the next hour, actually. So if you've already reached out to me about some stuff, I will be replying shortly. But man, if you don't understand the anatomy of the nephron, reach out to me, holla at a brother, let me know, and we can walk through a video, walk through an animation, and I can kind of get you situated on that, because you need to understand where things are going next, and you need to understand why things are happening the way they are. So here's the problem, all right? And I was kind of talking to my 211 face to face about this situation, because some of them didn't understand the importance of a nephron and why all of this is happening. All right. Here's the problem. Your blood has all the good stuff in it that your cells need. The problem is that all the waste products that your cells are making, they dump in the blood as well. So you've got good stuff like glucose, amino acids, fructose, calcium, magnesium, manganese, sodium, potassium, fatty acids, hormones. You got all the good stuff floating around in your blood. But at the same time, you got bad stuff like lactic acid, uric acid, urea, ammonia, all this bad stuff that's floating around in your blood as well. And you got to remember that your blood is made up of two different things. It's made up of formed elements, and it's made up of plasma. Formed elements are things like cells, platelets, but plasma is 92% water. So that's what we're dealing with. All the waste products and all the nutrients and good stuff are dissolved in the water. And you can't take one out without taking it all out. So when things are in the blood and just floating through the body, we don't have a way of systematically removing each individual item out of the blood plasma. It's all in there. It's kind of like if I put a drop of cyanide in a gallon of Kool-Aid, and you walked in and said, hey, that Kool-Aid doesn't have to be poisonous. If we just reach in there and pull that drop of cyanide out and pull out a half a cup of sugar, we could both call it even, and we can call it a day. You can't do that. I cannot physically walk up to a gallon of Kool-Aid and scoop out a half a cup of sugar that's been dissolved in the water in the Kool-Aid, nor can I reach in there and scoop out that drop of cyanide and walk away and everybody be happy. It's not possible. There has to be some type of process that allows you to engage something on a molecular level, and that's just it. We can do that with a nephron. The problem is we have to pull all the water out first. Now, all of this is happening at the nephrons, so we don't feel any different when this happens. The blood never leaves the kidney without having most of the water and nutrients return back to the blood before it ever leaves the kidney in the first place. So when that blood arrives at a nephron, what happens is it comes through an afferent arteriole, which initially branched off of an interlobular artery. So you got the interlobular artery goes up, and it looks like a tree, and then you got tree branches off of the interlobular artery, and those are afferent arterioles. And then afferent arteriole delivers blood to a renal corpuscle. Now, a renal corpuscle is made out of two things. It's made up of a Bowman's capsule, which is like a coconut, and inside the coconut, or the Bowman's capsule, is a big ball of capillaries called a glomerulus. And a glomerulus is made up of about 50 capillaries all in one big ball. That's what the glomer part of glomerulus means. It means ball. So you've got this ball of capillaries inside of a coconut, and the afferent arteriole goes inside the coconut, splits into about 50 capillaries in the size of a ball, and then the blood continues on out through an efferent arteriole. Now, while the blood is down in that big ball of capillaries, it's under a lot of pressure, hydrostatic pressure, which I know you probably hated that chapter. I know I hated that chapter when I had to learn that stuff. So there's that chapter on the cardiovascular system, and it gets into hydrostatic pressure and how hydrostatic pressure is initially pushing water and everything dissolved in the water out of the capillaries and into a space. And in this case, it's pushing it into the capsular space, which is the renal corpuscle, the Bowman's capsule. The Bowman's capsule is just it's a shell. And so we are using pressure to force water and anything dissolved in that water out of the capillaries and into the capsular space of the Bowman's capsule. Does osmotic pressure work there? Yes, it does. Osmotic pressure attempts to push things back into the capillaries, but we typically push enough of that stuff out of the capillaries and into the capsular space that we're going to actually be able to do something about filtering your blood. Another thing to keep in mind is that when you read in the chapter in the text, you find that your capillaries, those glomeruli, those capillaries, they're kind of weird. They're not like everybody else. They have these cells called podocytes that are wrapped around all of the capillaries. And the podocytes, the poto is referring to feet. And podocytes have little feet that connect with one another, and they literally grab one another like this, and they lock into place. And in between, you see the spaces in between my fingers? Those spaces in between my fingers are just like the spaces in between the feet of the podocytes. And those spaces are called filtration slits, and they make sure that water and anything dissolved in the water can come out, but they also make sure that large things like large plasma proteins don't come out, which is great because that works in favor of osmotic pressure, because osmotic pressure works based on plasma proteins, and it's what can pull things back into the capillaries. So hydrostatic pressure pushes things out of the capillaries into the capsular space, and whatever that is called filtrate. So when it was in the blood, we called it blood plasma. You catch that? So when it was in the blood, we called it blood plasma because it was in the blood. But now that solution, now that water solution has come out of the blood, out of the capillaries, into the capsular space, we call that filtrate because it just underwent filtration. We shoved this blood plasma through these filtration slits, and whatever stayed in the blood, and whatever came out, and whatever came out, we now call filtrate. And that filtrate now goes from the renal corpuscle into the renal tubule. And the renal tubule is made up of multiple pieces. The first one is the proximal convoluted tubule. Proximal convoluted tubule is extremely important because with that, now we have the filtrate and all of its contents left to have to be subjugated to a rigorous checking of the cells lining the wall. So in other words, you got a bunch of quality control cells sitting on both sides who can grab stuff as it goes along and say, hey, we want to keep this, nah, we want to throw that away. So when the cells undergo reabsorption, what's really happening is the cells in the proximal convoluted tubule are grabbing things like glucose and actively pumping the glucose out of the tubular fluid, which is what it's called once it goes from the capsule into the tubes. It's no longer called filtrate. It's now called tubular fluids because it's in the tubes. Once this fluid enters the tube, the cells on both sides of the tubes can then reach into the fluid and pull those molecules out of the fluid and put them back into the blood before the blood ever leaves the kidneys. So that's reabsorption. If there was something in the blood that needed to be put into the tube, that would be secretion. And so things flow down through the proximal convoluted tubule. Most of the nutrients that you lost into the filtrate that now has become tubular fluid, most of those nutrients you reabsorb. You take them out of the tubular fluid and put them back into the blood. Tubular fluid continues to the loop of Henle, which is made of the descending limb and the ascending limb. And in that loop of Henle, generally what they're doing is they're trying to regulate how much water is going to wind up being in your urine at the end. If you drink lots of water, you stay hydrated, then you're probably going to be able to get away with throwing away some of your water, so the water will continue on up the loop of Henle, up the ascending limb. If you're dehydrated, you don't drink enough water, then your body's going to say, forget that. It's going to release aldosterone, and it's going to cause you to reabsorb sodium. And because you're pulling salt out of the tubular fluid, water is going to follow it right on out, right behind it. So you can put that water back in your body, which unfortunately is going to begin to concentrate your urine, which can damage your nephrons and damage your kidneys and lead to some bad stuff. That's when you wind up having urine the color of Clemson orange at 2 in the afternoon. Your urine being Clemson orange at 5 in the morning is not a problem because you've been asleep all these hours. So you haven't been drinking water. You've been cutting lumber. But if it's 2 in the afternoon, you should have been drinking lots of water by then. And so your urine should actually be more diluted. It should be more of a straw colored yellow, not a Clemson orange. And God forbid it's a USC garnet. That's bad. That means there's blood in the urine. None of us want that. So back to the nephron. So the tubular fluid, it leaves the loop of Henle and continues up through the distal convoluted tubule. And the distal convoluted tubule is a very interesting structure because that's actually the location where you take things from drugs and you take them out of the blood and you put them into the tubular fluid. And once you make those adjustments, that tubular fluid now enters into the collecting duct. Once you're in the collecting duct, at that point, it's really not a lot that you do there. You probably are going to adjust water. So once again, if you're hydrated and you have plenty of water in your system, you're not going to adjust it too much. You're going to leave the water alone and let it continue to dilute your urine. However, if you're dehydrated, then ADH, antidiuretic hormone, is going to target the collecting duct and collecting tubule, and it's going to say, hey man, this joker won't drink water. He'll drink coffee, but he won't drink water. He'll drink Kool-Aid, sweet tea, and everything else. And not saying that stuff is bad, but it's not water. It'll say, hey, sorry, that's the cost of living. And ADH will be released. It'll target the collecting duct and collecting tubule. You'll reabsorb water out of the tubule and put it back in the blood, and it'll leave your urine very concentrated, which can become dangerous over a period of time. And once that fluid goes from the collecting duct and collecting tubule, we call that urine. We don't change the name of that ever again. So that's essentially what's happening with the nephron. People have trouble with the nephron, and I totally understand, because the thing that you got to understand with the nephron is there is no standard MO for the nephron. What the nephron will do to the water that it pulls out of the blood plasma each time is totally dependent on you. If you're hydrated, then the contents of your urine are going to be different. If you're dehydrated, the contents are going to be different. What you want to remember is just the basics, and then remember why it adjusts. That's the thing you really want to lean on instead of trying to memorize just one standard. The standards you should be memorizing is what each part of the nephron does. And then that way you'll remember, hey, if the proximal convoluted tubule is responsible for reabsorbing a very high percentage, nearly all of the nutrients, when it comes through, then that's what you want to remember. But the bad news is that if you force your proximal convoluted tubule to work too hard to reabsorb nutrients, like for example, people with high blood sugar, if you're not careful, you can force your proximal convoluted tubule to work too hard, and that causes a breakdown of the channels of the pumps that the cells are trying to use to move glucose out of the tubular fluid and back into the blood. If that happens, then you can start sending a lot of your sugar into your urine, and it doesn't get reabsorbed, and now you start having renal failure and all types of problems with your nephrons. So that's a general rundown of the nephron. Hope that helps a bit. And once you get past the nephron, everything else is like easy peasy. I'll probably say something else that you want to pay close attention to is the glomerular filtration rate. Glomerular filtration rate is not as difficult as it seems. At first, the textbook talks about it, and it's like, what the heck is this? But glomerular filtration rate is nothing more than a fancy term for what you learned in chapter 20 with capillaries and the net hydrostatic pressure when you're looking at that flow rate in a capillary. This is the same thing for glomerular filtration rate. You're just trying to figure out how much filtrate are you actually making each minute. That's all. And it deals with filtration concerning hydrostatic pressure and osmotic pressure. Oh, one other thing. Oh man, it was just on the tip of my tongue. Something else I wanted to remind you guys about when you're reading about glomerular filtration rate and the nephrons and all that good jazz. And oh, now I remember. Okay, all up until now, when blood goes through an arteriole and then it goes to a capillary, it usually goes to a venule and then goes to a vein and then a bigger vein and then a bigger vein and then ultimately the vena cava. Not in this case, okay? You need to pay close attention to this. Remember, when blood comes through the afferent arteriole and it goes into a Bowman's capsule, and then it breaks into 50 or more capillaries known as a glomerulus. Once it turns into a glomerulus, that blood exits the other end of that capillary, and then it goes through an efferent arteriole. It doesn't go to a venule. It goes through an efferent arteriole, and then the efferent arteriole continues to flow until it branches into a new group of capillaries called peritubular capillaries. And peritubular, peri meaning around, peritubular capillaries wrap around nephrons' tubules. So the renal tubules are covered with these peritubular capillaries, and that's how you get things reabsorbed out of the tubules and into the blood, and how you're able to secrete certain things out of the blood and into the renal tubules. That's how things get back and forth. And then after it leaves the peritubular capillaries, that's when it goes into venules and then goes into veins and then ultimately leaves the kidneys. So if you got any questions, just let me know. We'll probably be loading one more video early this week talking about the kidneys and talking about micturition and that kind of thing. So hope to talk to you soon. Peace.